So my name is Marilyn Thompson. I'm with the History Museum, and I want to introduce our panel tonight once again to you. To my left is Marvin Curtis, the Coordinator of Arts for the Equity and Public Art of the City of South Bend, Dean Emeritus, and Professor Emeritus of the Ernestine M. Rapin School of the Arts from IU South Bend. And yes. To his left is Christy Erickson, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the History Museum, and as such, is also oversees our entire curatorial department and education department. To my right, in matching jackets,
we planned that, of course. Yeah.
is Helen Ursary-Binion, RN, BSN, MSN, who is the daughter of Rosemary Sanders. And to Helen's right is Joseph Zimmerman, who is the Executive Director of the South Bend Symphony Orchestra. Tonight, our panel will be addressing some very short questions. And although our panelists could talk for hours eloquently about the questions that we are going to ask of them, we have respectfully asked them to use only just a few minutes to answer. So thank you for understanding. The title of our program, as well as the exhibit on view tonight, is Invisible Player. So let's focus on the word player for now. When we attend concerts or enjoy music in other ways, we often become so captivated by the beauty of the song that we overlook the incredible amount of effort and energy of the player who has produced the music. So Dr. Curtis, our first question is for you. How is the musical talent of an individual developed? How does desire and talent, opportunity, and exposure work together to create a musical talent such as Rosemary Sanders?
Well, to begin with, it requires dedication, but it requires a little bit of talent, just a little bit sometimes. And from there, it's being nurtured. So you have a teacher, you have people that nurture that talent. In Rosemary's case, Gertrude Oliver Cunningham nurtured that talent by providing her with the instrument, providing her daughters and Rosemary played together. They all played piano, they played violin. And in the end, Gertrude bought Rosemary Sanders a Stradivarius violin, unheard of. A Stradivarius violin can cost as much as several $1 million. This one probably cost about $3,000 or $4,000 in 1930. Worth now probably about $60,000. So to give a student an instrument like that, as well as she provided her with lessons. Rosemary traveled from here to Chicago to the Sherwood School of Music, which was one of the most prestigious schools of music in the country, because her teacher here in South Bend was a man named George Gaska, who was the concert master for the South Bend Symphony. So he taught Rosemary, but he was also on the faculty of the Sherwood School of Music. So she and her mother would travel on Saturdays on the South Shore train, which at that time was segregated. So Rosemary had to sit in a segregated car with her mother to Chicago and ride home in a segregated car in Chicago. So the same train that we take today from here to Chicago, I couldn't have sat in the same car with anybody that wasn't black. But in spite of all of that, that dedication, the love of music that Rosemary had, which is the love of music that many of us have, which is how I got to my own start, was nurtured by people. And yet, the barrier was there that she got in the orchestra, probably because Gertrude Oliver Cunningham's husband was C.F. Cunningham, who owned National Bank. Money begets money, and so she was probably given a chance to audition and perform. But they stuck her where they couldn't see her, in the back, in the very back of the orchestra, and never put her name in the program. In spite of that, Rosemary played for 15 years. Never had a chance to move forward, which is very unusual because usually you can move up the orchestra, but she wasn't. She didn't, and so the talent that she had kept her going. But she actually gave violin lessons to students at Notre Dame. So the woman had talent, but the recognition was not there. And so part of what we're doing now is helping to provide that recognition many years later. Rosemary died in 2017, and she was 95 years old. If you can imagine all those years that she played, and that talent was nurtured and passed on as she gave lessons to students, as she performed on that stage, and yet the recognition that she should have gotten was not given. And now we're going to give it to her. And that's how that works.
Thank you. And turn now to you, Christy. In 1929, the Great Depression began with a stock market crash. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to his first presidency of the United States. In 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, impelling the United States into World War II. And these were just some of the major events going on in the United States at the time that we are talking about with Rosemary Sanders. So can you take a few minutes and just describe to us what South Bend, Indiana was like in the 1930s and the 1940s, specifically concerning diversity and ethnicity?
Yeah, just a small topic to cover in just a few minutes, but like Dr. Curtis was saying, the story of Rosemary Sanders and also her parents is a very interesting piece to fit into the whole story of the South Bend area. So we know that her father, Raleigh, came here actually before the Great Migration. He came here in 1904 as a young man and was working for various wealthy or upper middle class white families. He lived with a woman in her carriage house and served as her driver here on Washington Street before working for the Olivers. And eventually saved up enough money to buy a house. And I know Helen's going to talk about this in much more detail and eloquence, but the house that he and his wife bought was on Bowman Street near the Steubenville Golf Course. And if you look at, there's maps that you can look at that we call redlining maps that were put together by real estate associations that classified different neighborhoods in South Bend and other big cities in the country as various levels of desirable or not desirable. And some of those things were based on the age of the neighborhood, but also the race of the people living in the neighborhood. And the philosophy behind that, according to the realtors, was that it's a more harmonious neighborhood if people of one race are all living together. In reality, it was a way to kind of get around the law and have segregated neighborhoods in town. But the home that the Sanders bought on Bowman Street was in a white neighborhood, though classified as declining at the time. But they paid cash, and a lot of African-American, almost all African-American families were largely unable to get loans for homes at the time. So that was probably the only way they were able to get enough money to buy that house. And that's just one of those kind of obstacles that Rosemary eventually and a family, and any family like hers, would have to overcome to be successful at the time. We mentioned the segregated rail cars on the South Shore, and of course it wasn't just those. The Enman Natatorium down the street was a segregated public pool. Many, even department stores in South Bend, didn't allow African American people to try on clothes inside the store. You had to just buy it and hope for the best. And in the 1920s, especially when Rosemary was a small child, she was born in 1921, the Ku Klux Klan here in Indiana and in South Bend was very strong and made their presence well known. And that would be an especially trying time to be growing up as a person of color or of any ethnicity. at the time besides white Protestant, true Americans, as they would say at the time. And music, especially. Again, as we heard in the trailer and as we'll continue to hear, in South Bend, a lot of music venues were segregated too. And one of the great stories we like to tell is in 1949 when Lionel Hampton concert at the Palais Royal, he was told that it was going to be blacks only, that it was going to be a segregated concert, and he said, absolutely not, I'm not playing unless it's integrated. And he had such drawing power that the owners of the Palais kind of caved and allowed it to be this big integrated concert, and that was when the Palais Royal became an integrated venue after this one person kind of stood up to the owners at the time. So lots of these different things, but again, one of the big changes that Marilyn mentioned was World War II, and World War II was also when a lot of the factories in town became integrated because it was President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which you may have learned about the Workers' House if you went over there, but that said that is any factory working on defense contracts had to be an integrated factory, though integrated didn't necessarily mean equal either. So again, another good example, Rosemary is in the symphony, but certainly not equal to the other people in the symphony. She's peeking out from the back, she's not appearing in the programs, and I'm sure there's a lot of folks who might say that she should be grateful for what she had, but we all know now what a great injustice that was to such a wonderful player as she was. So I'm sure I've exceeded my time. So.
No, thank you. In nearly all our lives, there is at least one, and often many more than one person, who has profound influence in our dreams, our decision, and our daily life. Helen, this question is for you. How did the Oliver family impact the world of Rosemary, your mother?
Well, I would need about a good hour and a half to tell you all of that, but the documentary is coming. But I would say that being in an environment of family of that status, elite status, certainly had a great impression on her. But not only that, being exposed to the arts, and not just music, not just the violin, but the piano, and also paintings. If you go through the Oliver Inn, you will see all sorts of beautiful still life paintings, just beautiful china, the furniture, it is all exquisite. When you are surrounded by an environment of this magnitude, and this is like on a daily basis, you have to take something from that, wanting more out of life, having dreams of your own. And clearly, even though my mother experienced the racism, she never said a mumbling word about that. She talked about what was needed to become a violinist or a teacher of music. That you had to have perseverance, that you had to have patience, that you had to have insight to your disadvantages and your advantages. She spoke all around it, I found through her writings. But she never once mentioned that she was mistreated in any way. But she used that to develop endurance and strength from within. And not only did that affect her, but it affected me and my brother, and it just trickled right on down. It's just amazing how important our legacy is, and that we have to search. I was just fortunate that I had documents dating back to the early 1800s, and that I could connect and see that you started here as a slave, but yet look how far you come. But still, it was not enough for Mom. And I'm just very, very proud of her right now. I'm sure she is smiling from heaven. Well, they finally did something.
So we've heard Rosemary Sanders auditioned and was accepted into the South Bend Symphony in 1940, where she played for 15 years, sitting in the last row of the second violin section. Her name was never listed in the program. She appears in the 1943-1944 formal photograph of the symphony, not sitting with the orchestra members, but behind the orchestra with only her head showing. So that brings us to the other word in the title of our program and exhibit, invisible. Justice, how did research about Rosemary and other African American musicians cause the birth of the Invisible Player Project? Once the history of the South Bend Symphony Orchestra was understood by you and others, how did the organization respond to help create a new environment for African American musicians?
Well, I think the orchestral world in America has known for a long time that we're not the most diverse set. Our audiences are very white trending, and our players are mostly white, and this is why we've done this documentary. So I think in our case, there was kind of this play of fiction that this is how the world is, and it's not right, but we're just living in it. And I think when our education manager, Stephen Stamer, and Dr. Curtis came across the story of Rosemary Sanders, I think it kind of painted that and made us realize our own culpability as an organization in perpetuating keeping people out. And so this is a journey that we've been on as an organization for a few years, much of it led by Dr. Curtis. And we're kind of doing as many things as we can. So there's a bunch of media projects. We're working, you saw Aaron working up here, who founded the Sphinx organization. Sphinx is the National Association for Black and Latino Orchestral Players. And we're partnering with them to use the audition process to bring in more diverse applicants. We have people coming in, I think from California, to play with the orchestra. One of the problems that we have in the orchestral world is that if you look at the country and the demographic breakdown of the country, and then you look at the American group of musicians that can play in an orchestra, they don't line up, right? Our musicians in America tend to be much more white, much more Asian than the rest of the population. And so some of this is figuring out the education and making sure that people still have access to the arts in school and find their interest at a young age and have access to these things. And then the other end of it is us reforming our audition practices and working with the union. We're a union workforce, and so all of our hiring practices are collectively bargained. And so there's a lot of wheels to change these things, but there's 150 years of doing it one way, and then it's a slow ship to turn around. So there's many different things that we kind of have to do all at once and build partnerships, not just in the community, but in the wider arts world to build the will among the artists for this and the managers.
Thank you. So you heard just a little bit from our panel, and now we want to invite you to ask the questions that you would like to ask of any one of our panelists, Christy, Marvin, Helen, or Justice. And please take a moment and think, and then we just want to hear from you.
Hi, my question is for Helen. You must have had a lot of music in your home growing up, so I'm just wondering if you have a favorite memory around music from having Rosemary Shimoda.
Yes, I was there when she was teaching students from Notre Dame. And, you know, that was at a very young age of 5. So I began to get more interested in the music field. But my thing was voice. I played in the orchestra for a while through high school. And then I just figured out I would never be a violinist like Mom. So I better move on and stay in my lane. So I did begin to sing in various groups throughout the community. And I do have a genuine love for music, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
My question is also for Helen. Did Rosemary keep in touch with any of the students or any of the people she mentored in the South Bend area when she moved away?
What do you mean when she moved away?
Well, I didn't know, but did she stay in this area the whole time and you?
I moved away. Mom was in this area her whole life from age 5 on.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
So did she keep in touch? Were they able, people she taught, I mean, Notre Dame students move along all over the world and country, like, was she able to keep in touch with her students that she had mentored and enjoy their success after she had taught them?
There were several students, as I can recall, that wrote letters. And my mother would answer those letters, so yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm not getting
Thank you. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you discovered the invisible player, since she was so invisible. Just how did that come about? Were you looking? Did it kind of fall in your lap? I would love to hear a little bit more about that process.
Well, it fell in our lap. Justice talked about Stephen Stammer, who was our education director. I should back up a little bit. Justice came to me 2021 and asked me to chair the EDI committee for the symphony. We had a discussion. I said, okay, only if you're serious. And he was. So we had a meeting of African American leaders in the community with the symphony and with Justice and with Alistair. And they unloaded. Because there's a history in South Bend of being not welcomed into the board of the symphony. And so during this time period, we did a lot of wonderful things with the whole thing. And Stephen found this article in the archives about Rosemary Sanders that Helen had written in the newspaper back in 2017. It was a Xerox copy. And he said, you might want to look at this. So I said, okay. So I read it, and there was too much missing. It was just not, it was like, wasn't all there. And so I began to look for her name in the programs and could not find it. And I thought, if she was in the symphony, why is her name in the program? It wasn't until I saw the photograph from 1943 and saw her in the corner, hidden away, that I realized that they didn't put her name in the program. And we searched for those 15 years and never a name. And then, of course, once I found that out, I went to Facebook and found her son, because I found her obituary on Google and listed her brother and Helen. So I contacted the brother, and he said, my sister has everything. I said, well, can you get me in touch with her? And he did. And Helen and I had this conversation on the phone, and all the pieces began to fit together. And there were things that she would tell me that now made sense. I went to Christy and I said, I got this idea. I need to go to the archives of the History Museum because a lot of the information on the symphony was in the History Museum. So we went through boxes, and I kept them busy for a while, trying to look for stuff. And that's where we found the picture. The picture was in the archive boxes. And so Chrissy and I started talking along with Stephanie and with Marilyn and with Brian about how to make this thing can work. As I began to piece together all these pieces. And then Justice, of course, encouraged all this. And so a year after we started the project was the Symphony's 90th year. And for that program, if you look at the program book, there's a half page about Rosemary Sanders. And that's the first time. And when Rosemary died in 2017, they contacted the symphony to ask somebody to come speak at the service. Mm-hmm. And the education director at that time went, but didn't know much about it, except that she was a woman in the orchestra. And so there wasn't much to go on. It was through Helen that I discovered that she went to Riley High School. That was in the obituary. But I didn't realize that she was the only black student in Riley High School in 1939. She had gone to Central High School for 3 years, and then when her father died, she ended up going to Riley. But none of that was in the, we had to piece that together. And through conversations with Helen, we began to put this thing together. And I said to Justice, this needs to be a documentary because there's so much here. But also, when I began to look at the symphonies, and you heard me talk about the Big Five. The Big Five were Cleveland, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Those were the Big Five orchestras at the time, and Justice can define what those were. They had the biggest budgets.
Yeah, they were the most significant.
Yeah, and so I began to look to see when they had their first African American player, and New York was first, and followed suit. But then Chicago showed up in 2002, and I was incensed because that's where I grew up. And why would one of the biggest orchestras wait all this time? So that not only made me angry, but it made me want to probe even more. So it was a piecing together of everything that came together. And then Justice and I talked to Chuck and Ryan and got them involved, and we started talking about how to make a film and how much it was going to cost. And we began to figure out how to make that happen. And finally, we had a plan. And the plan was, let's interview people. And Helen was our first interview. Helen came here for the first Juneteenth luncheon we had when we honored Brother Sage. She had to be in Indiana. And we brought her down to the archives and we sat with her for an hour. And it was fascinating to hear her talk about her mom and again piece together parts that were missing. And through that, we discovered, through Christy, just sent me a note, her mother came to South Bend when she was 5 years old because she had tuberculosis. And she was at the Children's Dispensary Hospital, which is now the Hansel Center. So that's where she was. Her aunt, who became her mother, worked for the Oliver Cunningham family. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we found out. So they ended up adopting her, and she stayed in South Bend. And because she was here, that got more started, and then discovered this and that. I discovered about going to the Sherwood School of Music. So it all began to work together. And so now we have this, and this is 10 minutes of what will hopefully be a 90-minute film about Rosemary. So that's how it got started. And it's just snowballed.
And so just to add a little bit onto that, that all got started because Helen thought it was important that the museum have some information about her mother. And that article that Marvin mentioned in 2017, she was kind enough to send us an article, a little write-up, and a couple of photos. And we said, our staff said, wow, it's amazing, and added it to, we used to do an article in the Tribune called The Fact that highlighted several different history topics. And then when this came up a little bit later, came up again. But you know what Dr. Harris is talking about, so all these piecing together parts of this is one of the things that can make this type of thing really challenging for us is we'd have so much information on civic leaders and titans of industry and businesses in town and things like that. What we don't have so much information about is kind of regular families or, you know, prominent women in the area or regular women in the area. And people 100 years ago often just didn't think that was really worth saving or worth, you know, saving for a museum. And so when we're trying to find out, you know, this women's history or minority history, this Rosemary's parents worked for the Olivers, and Gertrude Cunningham helped her get treatment for her tuberculosis because she was involved in the children's dispensary. And then, you know, we feel like she was invested in this young girl and kind of went from there. But none of these things are written in the journal or saved in newspaper articles or things like that. It's just kind of little breadcrumbs you try and pick up and make a coherent story, and with help from Helen, of course. But and how many other stories are these that exist here in our community that we don't know about that are so inspiring? And what I love so much about this project was we put, you saw the exhibit in the trailer up, and when Helen came to see it and how moved she was to see her mother featured in the exhibit, and you know, it's those types of things that remind us what we're here for and what we're here to.
Absolutely.
I think one of the powerful things that we're trying to do with the film is use Rosemary to personalize it. And I think to have a resource like the History Museum that can make her a full person, and Helen, of course, is huge, because for so many people in the orchestral world and the rest of the world who are thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, often it's a number or a percentage, and it's hard to hook into that. But now we have a real person that we can, that kind of illuminates the story, and you can kind of relate to that person and understand why these things are important. And hopefully on a national scale is the idea.
The other thing is, I'm sorry, just real quickly, Helen told me, because I couldn't figure out how her parents were able to buy a house on Bowen Street or Stradivarius. Well, they got paid in cash, so there's no receipts. Because that's the Cunninghams use cold hard cash. So it's hard to trace some of this stuff sometimes, because we've been looking for the receipt for the violin. Well, if she paid cash for it, there's not going to be one, you know. And so it makes it even more difficult. But we have a resource in Helen, and I have a resource in Christy in the museum. I'll call her and say, I need so and so and so, and next thing I know, she's found it for me. So we just have to keep digging. That's how those things happen.
And Mr. Cunningham was no less president of the National Bank, so I wouldn't have questioned a thing had I been here. So, just to say.
I just want to say I'm happy to hear. I was happy to see the young person here. That's where it should be, because I have a son, and Marvin knows my family very well, but I have a son who loves his viola, and he's a senior. He is a freshman in college, and he's grappling with the decision to do a major in music or a major in computer science, and partly because of the opportunity for him to do anything beyond college in music. And so my late husband was a music professor, and so he passed down that love of music to my children, and I got my niece at all. So I guess the question is, what do I say to my son who's a final year? Should I take the safe road and go into computer science? I should consider going into, because he really wants to play instantly, and he was going to be tonight. But anyway,
Is there, I mean, I know we're talking about the opportunities are there, hopefully in the future will be. 24 years ago, only that it was the first African American was in Chicago. So that's not very long. I mean, that's kind of right. But anyway, my point is, what do I say to my son who's grappling with that?
Justin.
Well,
This is a good question. I'm a failed actor, and so my parents should have told me that maybe you should do computer science. But I would say right now there are more opportunities for your son than there ever have been. And it comes down to the things we talked about. It sounds like he already has the access and the love, and so it just comes down to the hard work and perseverance. I think right now the doors are relatively open to him. You know, he may end up being the only one in a given orchestra, but the field is actively trying to right wrongs, and it's going to be slow. But there's not a lot of your son out there, and so I think people will step up to try and clear a path for him. And if they don't, someone else will. I mean, there's the young man in here who had a terrible experience in Kansas City. I think that's an outlier. And I think because he's making his story so public, that will continue to be an outlier. And, you know, there's a whole generation of leadership, both on the executive side and on the music side, that are all going to change in the next 10 years or so. And your son still has college and graduate school ahead of him. By the time he's out and looking for an orchestra job, I think it's going to be a completely different world to America. It has been in Europe for a long time.
I have got another question. I'm not very well into security, but I know that African American community have a very rich musical heritage. So when you take from gospel singers to jazz scene and a number of outstanding musicians. So what is that prevents the community members to be participating in the symphony or classical music? Because the talent is there. I mean, this abundant talent is there. So there must be a reason why not in the classical side.
You want me to do it?
I mean, I'll give my short take and you can correct me. I think it's an
let's do
access.
the long take.
I think it's an access issue. I think besides the injustice of the whole thing, one of the big travesties is that we have lost generations of talent that would have raised the bar for all of our orchestras. Because you're right, talent is there, and we just have not created the pathways or taken down the barriers to allow people to pursue this. And every year we don't do that, it gets harder and harder because classical music has this reputation for being not cool. And that's, you know, a problem beyond, you know, black people thinking about music. But it's I think it's an access thing, and it's a slow road back.
There's a small history of this also. Most American orchestras was started by Germans in the 1800s. All the players were German. All the conductors were German. That was it. If you were Italian and didn't look German, you couldn't get in. So and there were no women, it was all men. So as life began to change, African Americans were enslaved and viewed as not being as good as, even in the late 1800s. So what you find are orchestras and organizations not willing to accept black people, period. The other problem was unions. Unions owned most of the concert halls, Carnegie Hall, Town Hall, Chicago Symphony Hall, and there was a barrier there as well. One of the young man that you just saw, Josh Jones, who was the percussionist, had a problem. This is 2023. Yeah. He's in the Kansas City Symphony. He's the principal percussionist. Security kept questioning, why are you here? Show us your ID. Go to security. The man's in a tuxedo with malice in his hand. Okay? You got stop him? The orchestra management should have said, stop this. But they didn't. So you got barriers all around. And so for a lot of African Americans, it's just difficult. Rosemary was really a pioneer in many ways. That she sat there. She sat there for 50. How many of us would sit there for 50 years if somebody didn't put your name in the program? You know, there'd be riots in the streets, you know. But all these barriers were put up. There were black unions and white unions. In South Bend, and I think I'm correct on this, the dance halls were the black unions, but the white unions did not control the symphonies and control the other parts of it. So you could only play in certain parts of the city in South Bend. They didn't mix until the 70s when the unions came together. So there's always been this barrier. The best story I can tell is the Cleveland Orchestra. They had a cellist in the 50s and 60s, and he was African American. They went on a tour of Alabama, and segregation forbid him to be on the stage. George Zell of the Cleveland Orchestra said, if he doesn't play, we don't play. All of a sudden, the laws got changed. But how many of those orchestras did that? But they took a stand and said, we're not going to stand for this. But he could not stay in the same hotel with the orchestra because it was segregation. So there's all these barriers around that have made it not welcoming for African Americans to be in the orchestra. And if you are in the orchestra, you're still invisible in many ways because who's going to talk to you? I'm not sure how many people talked to Rosemary while she was there. I mean, can you imagine for 15 years you're playing in the back last seat and nobody sees you. Nobody comes up to you after the concert and says, congratulations. You're just there. So that's another part of that story as well. Things are getting better, and this film, I hope, will open up some doors to some conversations. That's Justice and I, we're presenting it at several conferences to say to people, look, you can change this, but this is the history that you need to understand.
We're going to be able to take one more question because we want you to be able to see the exhibit. Thank you.
My question is for Helen. Did your mom play the Stradivarius during her time in the South End Orchestra, and is that instrument still in your family?
The instrument is not still in the family, and we're thinking that it might have gotten lost in the fire some years ago. But she did play in the community. And I believe there were some programs at the church at the time that she was able to go and play, do a recital here and there. So, and that's when she was very young. So,
her mom was at St. John's Baptist Church here in town and did several recitals.
Thank you for your questions. They were probing and provocative and all in a wonderful way. Thank you for asking and helping us to be able to tell even more of the story. And now I think I need to turn off my mic so that my director can turn on his mic.
All right, how about another round of applause? I would just like to say, Helen, I'm so happy that you wrote that article in 2017 and that Marvin found that and that started this whole thing, because the recognition is so long overdue. So I'm applauding for that one more time. The History Museum is so very proud to be part of this in conjunction with so many other organizations and the sponsors that are involved with the Doshis being here, the Community Foundation of St. Joe County. We appreciate that. The History Museum, we have a tagline: we tell global stories through a local lens, and this is an incredibly significant global story. What a local lens we're looking through to highlight this story, and we are hopeful that this documentary really proves and makes a difference. So I thank you for joining us. I thank the panel once again for all of your candid answers. And I would encourage you to stop into the gallery just outside to see the panels. It was an exhibit that filled the hallway right outside this auditorium about a year ago. But saved that because we knew this documentary was coming. So take a look at, you can see that picture up close, see her peeking out from behind there, and let's all make sure that nobody has to peek out behind for future orchestras. Thank you all.